Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to host Professor Ricardo Silvestre, all the way from Brazil, a continent where most of us have never even entered, but we are very happy to have him here, at least through Zoom. And his title of his talk is Contradiction in Bhedābheda Vedānta, a Paraconsistent and Dialetheic account of Jiva's Acintya Bhedābheda theology. Let me read his bio and then I'll request him to take over and present his talk. Dr. Ricardo Silvestre is a full professor at the Federal University of Campina Grande, a senior researcher at the University of Brasília, and a member of the philosophy graduate program at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, all located in Brazil, of course. He has been a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford, UK, the University of Notre Dame in US, the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies in UK, and the Center for Comparative Philosophy at San Jose State University in the US. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Montreal, Canada. His research interests include philosophy of religion, philosophical logic, Indian philosophy, and philosophy of mind. He is particularly drawn to the logical and philosophical aspects of concepts of God, with a focus on underrepresented religious traditions, those from India. A specific area of interest is the Bhedābheda Vedānta tradition of Jīva Gosvāmī, 16th century. The interest in concepts of God also encompasses panentheism and its relationship to panpsychism, as well as contradictory concepts of God and the logical dimensions involved, which include paraconsistency. He is currently the leader of a project funded by the John Templeton Foundation titled Concepts of God and the Variety of Theisms in Indian Traditions, towards a theistic theory of consciousness. Welcome, sir. All yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be able to speak in your webinar. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, I suppose everyone has been able to see the slides. Well, before I start, some few words about what I want to accomplish here. Well, that's the title of the talk, Contradiction in Bhedābheda Vedānta. And there's a subtitle, a Paraconsistent and Dialectic Account of Jiva's Acintya Bhedābheda Theology. Well, this talk is really based on a paper of mine, which will be published next year in Theological, but it should be online, I was told, in a couple of weeks. And the whole thing, the paper and the talk and everything we're doing is funded by is related to this project, which you mentioned, Dr. Pankaj, Concept of God and the Variety of Theisms in Indian Tradition, which is funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Well, just a very quick introduction, just for you to have an idea of what I plan to do here. So I'm going to speak about one specific Bhedābheda tradition, the one of Jīva Gosvāmī from the 16th century. So basically, I will show that there is a disagreement, a very important disagreement among commentators, as far as the contradictory aspect of this tradition is concerned. Because Bhedābheda, as I will show, we know that means difference and non-difference. So at least on its superficial level, it seems to be a kind of contradictory claim that Brahman or God is at the same time different and non-different from the world and individual souls. So there are two basic lines of thought, I would say, and I'm going to speak about that. One of them say that yes, there is an actual contradiction here, and the other one will say that no, there's no contradiction. So I'm going to show this disagreement, and my goal is to offer a logical account that somehow harmonizes those two different views. And one thing that I have to say is that my talk, unfortunately or fortunately, depends on how much one is is into logic, it will involve some technicality. I'll try to keep that to a minimum, okay? And I will go slow when I will start showing my logical system, but I can't avoid that. And this account of mine will be based on a Paraconsistent and Dialetheic logic created by Grand Priest in 79, which is called the logic of paradox. I'm going to speak about that. And of course, I'm going to say what Paraconsistence means, what is dialetheism, and how this somehow relates to my topic. Okay, so I will start. So before I start speaking about Jiva's tradition, just a few words about Bhedābheda Vedānta schools in general. So we're all familiar with Shankara's Vedanta, who claims more or less that Brahman and is everything that it is identical with the world and the individual selves. And on the other hand, we are also familiar with Madhva, who says that who emphasize difference, that God is different from the world and from individual selves. So Bhedābheda Vedānta schools, they are somehow in between those two extremes. So basically, those schools, it's a family of schools, right? Not just one tradition or one school, Bhedābheda Vedānta, or just Bhedābheda. So basically, these schools, they claim that what I'm going to call here ultimate reality, which is referred to by terms like Brahman or Atman, in some case Tattva. So that ultimate reality is both different, bheda, and non-different, abheda, from the world and individual selves. I'm going to call this the Bhedābheda claim. Behind this is an old doctrine called Parinamavad, that says that the world is a real transformation, parinama, of Brahma. And very strongly related to that, it also claims that individual selves, they are part of Brahma. Like in many Indian traditions, analogies are very important here. So there's this famous analogy that says that just as the essence of clay remains unchanged when transformed into a pot, the world retains the same essence as its ultimate cause, Brahman. So there is a kind of ontological oneness or non-difference between Brahman and the world. Or also we can say that there is a kind of ontological continuity that extends from Brahman to the world and individual selves. But my real concern here is the following. Is this Bhedābheda Vedānta claim or Bhedābheda claim contradictory? Because if you translate non-difference in terms of the negation of difference, and we can do that. We have this statement that says that Brahman is different from the world and individual selves, and it is not the case that Brahman is different from the world and individual selves. So we have here a classical instance of a claim of the kind A and not A, or A and it is not the case that A. And that's the classical example of a contradiction, right? So the question is this Bhedābheda claim contradictory, or in other words, are Bhedābheda schools contradictory theologies? The standard answer is no. And in order to explain that, I'm gonna refer here to Andrew Nicholson's book. He has a nice book about Vijñānabhikṣu, but he also speaks quite broadly about Bhedābheda traditions and about Hinduism in general. So speaking specifically about Vijñānabhikṣu, he says the following. Vijñānabhikṣu never attempts to uphold a statement in the form D and not D. Instead, he understands difference and non-difference to be a case of D1 and not D2. D1 might stand for difference in one sense, such as mutual absence, while not D, while in not D. D2 refers to difference as separation. By mixing the different definitions of difference and non-difference in such a ways, Vijñānabhikṣu can avoid logical contradiction. So the idea here is very, very simple. As is explained in the case of Vijñānabhikṣu. Basically, he understands the word difference in one of the parts of the conjunction in one way, and he interprets the word difference in the other part of the conjunction in a different way. So in this way, he doesn't get a contradiction. In case of Vijñānabhikṣu, in the first occurrence of difference is seen as mutual absence. In the second occurrence of difference, the same word is seen as meaning something else, namely separation. And you can say that the same strategy is used by other Bhedābheda scholars, such as Bhaskara and Nimbārka. So it's we can say a quite standard approach used by Bhedābheda scholars. So in this way, we can say that most Bhedābheda Vedanta schools are not contradictory theology, but there might be an exception, which is exactly Jīva Gosvāmī's Vaiṣṇava Vedanta school, which is known as Acintya Bhedābheda, and it's strongly linked to the medieval saint Sri Krishna Caitanya. So now I'm gonna speak a bit about Jīva Gosvāmī's tradition and show how somehow many people see it as a contradictory theology, as an exception to this standard I just mentioned. Okay, so Jīva Gosvāmī basically he takes a specific Purana, the Bhagavata Purana, as the core of his theology. And in one verse of this Purana, ultimate reality is called or is referred to by the term tattva. And this tattva or ultimate reality, this verse says, is referred to by three words: Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So here he's using the word Brahman in a different sense. Brahma is, we might say, an aspect of ultimate reality, as it is Paramatma and Bhagavan. But it is very important to Jīva that this third aspect of Tattva, Bhagavan, is Tattva in its full manifestation, in the sense that in Bhagavan, all kinds of Shakti, energy or divine power, are manifested. So that's why this ultimate reality or Bhagavan is called Shaktiman, the possessor of Shakti. I'm gonna use this term, okay, Shaktiman. So the idea basically is that, I mean, this is interpreted in different ways, but it can be understood from a conceptual or epistemological standpoint, in the sense that this tattva, this ultimate reality, it manifests itself in different ways. So it can be experienced as Bhagavan, as Brahman and Paramatma. In the case of Brahman, Brahma is like Bhagavan without its splendor and glory, without all the Shaktis that it possesses. So it's a kind of Brahma, more or less like Shankara's, but we must remember it's just an aspect of something which is not impersonal. And that's very important for Jīva, because Jīva's concept of ultimate reality is basically personal. So Jīva's concept of ultimate reality is basically a concept of God. Bhagavan or Krishna has personhood. He is a conscious subject, possesses several mental states, such as will, belief, and everything that characterizes, from a broad perspective, something as a person. Okay, one very important thing for Jīva is the way he uses the concept of Shakti. So first of all, Jīva defends that I'm going to use the word God. Okay, God's Shakti or Bhagavan's Shakti is intrinsic to God's very nature, in such a way that here there is an ontological continuity that extends from God to God's Shakti. And again, here, of course, you're going to find a lot of analogies trying to make sense of that. So just as fire and its light are inseparable, with light naturally emanating from fire. God, several kinds of Shakti are equally inseparable from God. They ontologically depend on God, or they are grounded on God, and they arise from God's own nature. This is very important for Jiva. One second thing about the concept of Shakti is that there are several different kinds of Shakti. And again, here we have an analogy that might help us to understand that. So Jiva says that the sun gives rise to at least three things. First, the radiance within its orb. Second, the rays that extends outward from it. And third, the sun's reflection on the surface of water, for instance. So the sun represents Tattva, God, Bhagavan, while one represents the internal Shakti, Antaranga or Swarupa Shakti that basically corresponds to God's divine attributes, his abode, where he realizes all his activities, leelas. And second, the rays that extend from the sun. They correspond to Tatastha Shakti, the marginal Shakti, which corresponds to us, the individual souls who are living in this world. And three, the sun's reflection on the surface of water, correspond to Bahiranga Shakti or Maya Shakti, or the external Shakti, which corresponds basically to the, between other things, it comprises the stuff from which this world is made. But a very important point in the analogy is that while those three aspects of the sun all proceed from the sun and ontologically depend on the sun, they are grounded on the sun, their relationship to the sun varies in terms of proximity and connection. So we have that Maya Shakti, the material world, is more distant than the Bahiranga Shakti, the individual selves, and more distant than the internal Shakti or the Swarupa Shakti of Bhagavan. So one very important point when you compare Jiva's Bhedābheda Vedānta with other Bhedābheda traditions is that in Jiva, we have a special kind of Parinamavada, which some people call Shakti Parinamavada, because the world is not a transformation of ultimate reality directly, it's a transformation of Maya Shakti. So just indirectly, the world can be said to be a transformation of Tattva or ultimate reality. All right, so, but getting to what really interests me, which is the way Jiva interprets this Bhedābheda claim. So here we can reframe this Bhedābheda claim in terms of Shakti and Shaktiman, because both the world and individual selves are Shakti of Bhagavan. And Bhagavan, or God, or Tattva, remember that Bhagavan is Tattva in its full manifestation, right? We can call him or it Shaktiman, the possessor of Shakti. So I'm going to use this terminology, Shakti on one hand and Shaktiman on the other hand. So in this way, Jiva's Bhedābheda claim can be stated as follows. It's S. Shakti and Shaktiman are different and non-different from each other. However, Jiva adds a very important qualification. He says that this claim is inconceivable, Acintya. So this is important, but I mean, from a textual point of view, it might be at least controversial. It's important because that's the way Jiva's tradition is referred, as Acintya Bhedābheda. So in Acintya usually is translated as inconceivable. That also might be controversial. Some people say that in Jiva, Acintya doesn't really mean inconceivable, but some other people say that it does. In fact, most commentators, they agree that in Jiva, Acintya means inconceivable. So I'm going to stick to that, okay? It's also interesting, at least, that Jiva mentions the expression Acintya Bhedābheda just twice in his big work, which is called the Six Sandarbhas. He mentions that just twice in a commentary that he writes on the first four Sandarbhas, so it doesn't even appear in his main work. All right, so that's basically how I'm going to understand Jiva's Bhedābheda claim. It has two parts. The first part, which I call S, Shakti and Shakti are different and not different from each other. And the second part, which I call A, which claims that this sentence S is inconceivable. All right, so let's move on. All right, as I mentioned in the beginning, usually this Bhedābheda claim, Jiva's Bhedābheda claim, is interpreted in two different ways. First, there is a contradictory interpretation, which by far is the standard one among scholars. Oh, one important thing I forgot to mention. In this talk, I'm going to rely on commentators, all right? I have my own opinion about which one is the correct interpretation when I go to Jiva. I'm gonna here speak just about this disagreement among scholars. And at the end of the talk, I'm gonna mention a bit about what I think is Jiva's. Basically, there's a kind of ambiguity that's pretty clear, even in Jiva's work. But for the sake of this talk, I'm gonna speak just about how scholars interpret Jiva's theology, and more specifically Jiva's so-called, as I'm calling it, Bhedābheda claim. So basically, this first interpretation says that really we have a contradiction here. So basically, because of that, difference in both parts of the conjunction means the same thing. So we have here that Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other, and it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other, where difference means basically the same thing. And beside that, we have the claim that this claim, which I'm calling SC, is inconceivable. Just to give you an idea of what scholars speak about that in this specific sense, here I have a quotation from Obiel Kapoor, which I'm going to read. The inconceivability of the relation is evident from the contradiction it involves. The Acintya is that which is illogical, but we have to accept on the basis of the holy texts. The concept of Acintya is born out of respect for scriptural authority, which ignores the law of contradiction. So key for this interpretation is the way many people understand the word Acintya. So it's Acintya, inconceivability, which supports basically this interpretation, because contradictions are inconceivable, right? So if Jiva's Bhedābheda claim are not, sorry, if Jiva's Bhedābheda claim is not contradictory, why he would use the word Acintya? Why he would say that it is not inconceivable? So this is more or less the reasoning which is behind this interpretation. Of course, there are a lot of textual evidences from Jiva himself which point to that direction. However, there's a second way to interpret Jiva's contradictory, so-called or supposed contradictory claim. And what is quite interesting is that we find the second interpretation in many of those same scholars that defend the contradictory interpretation. So I have here another quotation also from Kapoor. I'm going to read it. Just as there is absolute identity, just as there is neither absolute identity nor absolute difference between fire and its power, there is neither absolute identity nor absolute difference between Brahman and his Shakti. So if we interpret absolute identity in terms of partial difference, we have this SK, which I'm going to read. Shakti and Shaktiman are partially different from each other. And it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktiman are absolutely different from each other. See that in the first part of the conjunction, we mentioned partial difference. In the second part of the conjunction, we mentioned absolute difference. So these are two different senses of difference. So in this way, this claim is obviously not contradictory, because on one side, it speaks about partial difference, and on the other side, it speaks about absolute difference. So here we have a non-contradictory interpretation, and Kapoor is not alone. Some scholars, they also use the same kind of terminology. They don't say, I mean, basically which they really emphasize. Kapoor, for instance, and Gupta as well, is really the contradictory interpretation. But when speaking about Jiva's theology, many times they use this partial difference and absolute difference vocabulary, which can be interpreted in a way that the claim itself won't be contradictory. All right, so we have here, as I see it, a problem, a theological problem. I'm gonna call it a theological problem. Some people might say a philosophical problem, an interpretation problem, but that's just a terminological choice. There's a problem, right? And the first part of the problem is that the two interpretations conflict. So which one is the right interpretation? Is Jiva's Bhedābheda Vedānta a contradictory theology or not? So that's quite important in my view. Okay, but each interpretation has some problems on its own. So about the first interpretation, the contradictory interpretation, the first problem, which is number 2, it is that it conflicts with the analogies. For instance, the analogy of fire and the analogy of the sun and the sun ray. Oh, Jiva says that they are both different and non-different at the same time, but there is no contradiction involved. You can understand quite well why the sun and the sunlight are, in some sense, somehow different and non-different from each other. There is no contradictory. So this interpretation, it conflicts with the contradiction, with the analogies, and the analogies are also not inconceivable. We can conceive quite clearly why we might say that the sun and the sun ray are different and non-different. It also conflicts with some of Jiva's arguments. He does use something very close to the law of no contradiction, for instance, when he tries to refute rival positions. But perhaps the biggest problem is that this interpretation turns Jiva's theology into a contradictory theology. And you have here the law of non-contradiction, which Kapoor mentions. And of course, the law of non-contradiction, we can think that, oh, that's a Western creation. But Nyaya has its own formulation, for instance, of the law of non-contradiction. And the problem, I mean, the law of non-contradiction can be formulated in different ways. But one way it might be formulated is something like that a contradiction can't be true. Right? And if we follow this formulation, so the consequence is that if this interpretation is the correct one, Jiva's theology can't be true. So it is a priori false. So we have a theology, a lot of statements, systematized about God, about the world, about the relation between God and the world, about individual selves, and so many stuff. And all of that, we know a priori that it is false, because it is based on this contradictory claim that God is different and non-different from the world and from individual self. And also there is another consequence, which is based on another logical principle, which is not very famous. It has a very odd name, the principle of explosion. Basically, it's a logical principle that says that from a contradiction, A and not A, we can conclude anything. So there is a kind of inferential explosion. So explosion in the sense that, according to classical logic, if we have a contradiction, we'll be able to conclude anything from it, anything, and anything, really anything. I mean, statements that are not even remotely related to alpha and not alpha. So there's an inferential explosion, so a trivialization of the theory from a contradictory theory, a contradictory theology, we conclude anything. So one consequence of that is that we won't be able to coherently reason about Jiva's theology, because if from it we conclude anything, so we won't be able, for instance, to say which things are compatible with Jiva's theology, which statements, which worldviews are not compatible with Jiva's theology, because anything would be compatible with it, because we'd be able to conclude anything from it. Okay, and the second interpretation has also some problems. The first one is that the problem number 5 is that Jiva's terminology is restricted to difference and non-difference. It doesn't use this absolute and partial vocabulary. So it's a kind of exegetical problem. And the second problem number 6, is that how to make sense of a key, because I'm looking at the formulation of the second interpretation. So SK says that Shakti and Shaktima are partially different from each other, and it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktima are absolutely different from each other. So the second part of Jiva's Bhedābheda claim is a K, which says that SK is inconceivable. But SK is not inconceivable at all. On the other hand, I can quite easily understand and conceive a situation where two things are partially different from each other and are not absolutely different from each other. It's quite easy. It's quite conceivable. All right. So that's basically the problem that I want to address. So I'm planning to speak for 50 minutes. So I have 20 minutes left. So I'm going to speak a bit about the logical framework that I'm going to use. It is based on, as I mentioned, Grand Priest's logic of paradox, which is a Paraconsistent and Dialetheic logic. So very, very quickly, dialetheism is basically the position that claims that there are or there might be true contradictions, dialetheias. So that's what usually people speak as being dialetheism. Is the idea, a bit odd, many people think, that there are or there might be true contradictions. And a logic is paraconsistent when it doesn't satisfy that principle I just spoke about, the principle of explosion. So in a paraconsistent logic, you might have a contradiction, but from that contradiction, we won't be able to conclude anything. The two positions, dialetheism and paraconsistency, they are related to each other, but they are not identical. Okay, you might have a paraconsistent logic which is not dialetheic. But usually a dialetheic logic would be paraconsistent. So dialetheism needs paraconsistent, but paraconsistence doesn't need dialetheism. So about the logic of paradox, Priest's logic is a three-valued logic. We know that usually when you think about true values, we have true on one hand and false on the other hand, and that's it. So a three-valued logic adds a third true value. And in this case, is the true value both true and false. That's a third way we can assess a proposition or statement. So a statement might be both true and false. So it is a dialectic logic, because there might be a proposition alpha, such as that alpha and not alpha is both true and false. That's the main point of the logic. And it is also paraconsistent. So I'm going to use this logic, but I'm going to interpret it in a different way. Basically, it's the same logic, it's the same logical system, but instead of using this third true value, both, I'm going to use a different one. I'm going to use partially true. So in this new system, which I call a logic of partial truth, LPT, I have those three true values: true, false, and the third one is partially true. All right. So here I won't speak much about that because I don't have much time. So I have just the parts that interest me about the truth tables of the conjunction, the negation, and the disjunction. So in this logic, both true and partially true are designated truth values. A designated truth value is the true value that is preserved in the inference of the logic. Okay, and in this logic, we can see looking at those truth tables, but because of time, I won't mention that. But we can see that in this logic, the so-called disjunctive syllogism rule is not valid. So this is an inferential rule, says that from A or B and not A, I can conclude B. So this is not valid in LPT, in my logic. And because of that, the principle of explosion is also not valid. We can see in the last square, in the last box, that the principle of explosion depends on the disjunctive syllogism. So because of the disjunctive syllogism rule is not valid in this logic, also the principle of explosion is not valid. So this logic is paraconsistent. About the law of non-contradiction, that's an important point because this logic incorporates just a weak form of dialetheism. In its like weak sense, we might say, if I formulate the law of non-contradiction as WLNC, there cannot be a proposition alpha such that alpha and not alpha is true. So this formulation of the law of non-contradiction is still valid in the logic of partial truth, because contradictions can't be true, but they can be partially true in this logic, and that's why it incorporates a weak form of dialetheism. So even though contradictions can't be true, they can be partially true, which partial truth is a kind of truth, right? So in this way, it is a dialectic logic, but only in a weak form. All right. So how I'm going to use this framework to solve those problems I mentioned earlier. All right, so basically, I'm going to use the first interpretation, the contradictory interpretation, the interpretation that says that Jiva's Bhedābheda claim is really contradictory, and Shakti and Shaktima are different from each other, and it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktima are different from each other, where the word difference has the same sense. So that's like my starting point. I'm going to assume the first contradictory interpretation of Jiva. But I will assess those claims within my three-value semantic framework. So in this way, if I do that, remember that in this framework, statements can be true, they can be false, but they can also be partially true. There is a third true value. And it is in this way that I'm going to assess Jiva's theology. So basically, I will say that SC, Jiva's Bhedābheda claim, is partially true. I won't say that it's true. I won't say it is false. I'm going to say that it is partially true. So if I say that Shakti and Shaktima are different from each other, if I say that this is partially true, the conjunction Shakti and Shaktima are different from each other, and it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktima are different from each other, this will also be partially true. This is a consequence of the way the truth tables are organized within this framework. So in this way, SC itself is partially true. So we have a contradiction that is partially true. So why within that framework we might see those 6 problems as solved? So first of all, and this is very important, this interpretation of mine, it incorporates the second non-contradictory interpretation. Why? Because see, remember that the second interpretation will not speak of difference per se. It will speak about partial difference and absolute difference. That's why the second interpretation is not contradictory, right? But in this case, I assess the whole claim, Shakti and Shaktima are different from each other from a partial perspective, from a partial perspective in terms of truth. So in this way, when I say that Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other is partially true, I'm basically saying that Shakti and Shaktiman are partially different from each other, right? And when I say that it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other is partially true, I'm basically saying that it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktiman are absolutely different from each other. So the basic idea here is that on the level of the logical language, on the level of statements, right? So I'm using the first interpretation. But on the semantic level, on the level of true values, then I'm using the second interpretation because I'm assessing statements in terms of partial true. And remember that the second interpretation won't speak about difference, it will speak about partial difference and absolute difference. So in this sense, while on the level of the logical language, on the level of language, we might say, I use the first interpretation. On the level of the semantics, on the level where we assess the true value of statements, on this level, I use the second interpretation. So in this way, I really, as I promised, in some sense at least, I harmonize both interpretations. The second problem about the analogies in this framework, they're valid. Because the analogy of the sun and sun ray, I just say that the sun and sun ray are really non-different from each other, but this is partially true, not completely true. So the analogy are still valid. The law of non-contradiction in its strong form is still valid because in this framework, contradiction can't be true. It can be partially true, but the classical formulation of the law of non-contradiction is still valid. It is a Paraconsistent and weak Dialetheic approach. So in this way, Jiva's theology is a contradictory theology, but just in a weak sense. It is a contradictory theology because its claim is partially true. Its contradictory claim is partially true. But its contradictory claim is not true. In this framework, SC is not true. It is just partially true. And because it is Paraconsistent, you can reason about the theology. The fifth problem, I keep, say, Jiva's terminology, because this problem has to do with the fact that Jiva doesn't use like a partial and absolute difference terminology. He just sticks to difference and non-difference. So as I said, on the level of the language, this solution keeps the difference, non-difference vocabulary, which is Jiva's vocabulary, which is Jiva's terminology. And about the sixth problem, basically, because in this framework there are two true values, true and partially true, right? So I just say that AC, which claims that SC is inconceivable, is ambiguous. And from that ambiguity, I might claim that it is both inconceivable that it makes sense, let's say, that it is inconceivable that SC is true, and it makes sense that it is inconceivable that SC is partially true. So because of that ambiguity, I can claim that SAC itself is partially true. So that's how I solve the last problem. So not only SC is partially true, but AC itself is partially true. So it is partially true that this Bhedābheda claim is inconceivable. All right, so I'm almost done. So some final remarks, and these are quite important remarks. So the first remark is that within this framework, I claim it is compatible with the whole idea of Jiva's Bhedābheda Vedanta, and in fact, Bhedābheda Vedanta schools in general. So I explained the whole thing about these traditions using these this terminology that there is a kind of ontological continuity that extends from Brahman to the world individual selves, or in the case of Jiva, that extends from Shaktiman to Shakti. And this partially true framework, it incorporates that. Because if we say that Shakti and Shaktiman are non-different from each other, if we say that this is partially true, we say that there is something from Shaktiman that is passed through Shakti. So there's a kind of ontological oneness between both. And this is represented by saying that the fact that they are non-different from each other is partially true. I couldn't say that this is true. And Kapoor, he elaborates on that. I can't say that it is true that Shakti and Shaktiman are non-different from each other, because this is basically the Advaita position, according to like the standard interpretation, although that's a bit controversial. And I can't say either that Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other, because that's Madhva's position, Dvaita Vedanta's position. So really the middle is to say that both claims are just partially true. They are neither true nor false. They are partially true. Okay, one important point, if we speak about, I spoke about a bit about dialetheism, which is a quite controversial position, but some people, they make the distinction between metaphysical and semantic dialetheism. Here there's a quotation from Edward Morris. He was the one who coined this terminology. I'm going to read it. While metaphysical dialetheism is the view that there are things in the world that are actually inconsistent, so this is metaphysical dialetheism, which is basically the position that Grand Priest defends. Semantic dialetheism is the view that there are no inconsistencies in things. Inconsistencies arise or may arise because of the relationship between language and the world. So this approach of mine, it's closer to semantic dialetheism than to metaphysical dialetheism, because remember that contradictions, they are not true, they're just partially true. So the way this reflects in the world might not entail, and I would say doesn't entail, an ontological contradiction, a situation where object A has property F and doesn't have property F. That's kind of ontological contradiction. By the way, that's one of the ways Aristotle frames the law of non-contradiction in ontological terms. So in this way, my approach doesn't entail that Jiva's ontology is ontologically or metaphysically contradictory. Okay, one question that some of you might have raised in your head is about the concept of partial truth. I'm almost done. I didn't say what it means, and that's a very, very important question. What partial truth means? So there are some options here in the paper. I do give what I call a temporary definition. I say that, hold on. Yeah, I give a tentative definition, something between that partial truth is something between truth and falsity, bearing ontological weight, that suggests the existence of an actual state of affairs underlying sentences, partial truth. And I have some options here. First, I can leave it undefined, because when logicians, they use truth and falsity, they don't bother to define the term. That's something that philosophers of language and metaphysicians, they should take care of. So I could do that. I could also use a third interpretation, which, in my view, it might be quite interesting. That gives some kind of emphasis on the analogies in Jiva's Bhedābheda, because as in other Bhedābheda schools, a lot of analogies are used here. So we might perhaps use a position that was defended by Aquinas, for instance, that language cannot describe God in an univocal and direct manner. So that's we use analogies. So this is a very old theological doctrine, let's say, that basically says that language per se is incapable of grasping, of characterizing properly God. That's why we use analogies, because that's the only way we have to talk about God or to know God. So I can use this idea and basically say that the importance of analogies in Jiva's Bhedābheda lies on that. So in this way, the more far we can get to grasping God is this partial truth vocabulary. And in this way, we can't go beyond. We can't really say what partial truth is. But there is a third option, which I will follow, and I mentioned that a bit en passant in the paper, but I'm gonna work on another paper where I do define partial truth. I won't be able to give more details about that, but I use a very important key, which is given by Bhaktivedanta Swami, which is a follower of Jīva Gosvāmī. He's the founder of the Hare Krishna movement, where basically he qualifies difference in terms of a qualitative and a quantitative way. So this idea can be used to build a different kind of semantics that will give minimally satisfactory, I would say, answer for the question what partial truth means. But because of the time, I won't speak of that. So here are the references I mentioned, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this intriguing, insightful, so many topics you touched and explained so nicely. Let's invite some questions. If there are any, they can unmute themselves and they can join the discussion. They can talk directly to you if they want to. There are 8 participants still attending. All of them are here, Professor Theodore and Professor Sardella from Sweden, Dr. Theodore from Israel. My students, Ankita Salunke is also here. So welcome everybody. You can unmute and talk directly if you want to. Any questions, anyone?
I think I was too heavy on the logical side.
I'm silent and waiting for an okay. I think Dr. Sardella is asking something. Maybe. Yeah. Oh, Ankita, you can unmute and talk directly. My student is asking something.
Yes. Hello, sir. Thank you for the wonderful session. I am interested in Jīva Gosvāmī's, whole Bhedābheda Tattva. Like, I follow it. Yeah. So I would like to know, like, there are so many issues and topics in Indian schools of philosophy and Western philosophy as well. So I wonder what made you choose Jīva Gosvāmī's Bhedābheda Tattva.
Okay. First of all, the first part of the answer, I'm a logician, so naturally I'm interested in contradictions, and I'm also a paraconsistent logician. And right now there's a kind of trend about some people call the contradictory God thesis. In fact, this paper of mine will be published in a special issue of Theological, which will be dedicated to contradictory theology. So there will be a paper on Christianity. Just to give a glimpse of the debate, perhaps the most famous proponent of the idea is a logician and philosopher called J.C. Beale. He's a Christian. And in Christianity, we have several kinds of contradiction, right? The Trinity, the doctrine of Trinity, and also the idea that Jesus has a human nature and a divine nature. And he basically defends what he calls contradictory Christology, that we have to, instead of trying to explain away the contradiction, which people have been trying to do for centuries, we should accept that Jesus is a contradictory entity. So there's a trend. Many people are trying to dig out. In fact, a recent volume came out, edited by priests, about like contradiction in different kinds of religions. So that's the first part of the answer, because Bhedābheda schools, they have the label that they use to name their schools. Bhedābheda is a contradiction, right? So it's an interesting topic to find out whether or not these schools are really contradictory. And the second answer, because it is a personal aspect. I try to be a follower of Jiva. I'm connected to the Hare Krishna movement, so it's a personal motivation.
Yes.
Thank you for answering. Yeah, Ankita, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for answering. It answers my question. And I am also connected to Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Good to know.
Yes, thank you, Ankita. Dr. Sardillo is written something. You can unmute and speak if you don't want to, sir.
Yes, can you hear
Yeah,
me?
please. Yes, please.
Yes. So thank you for your very clear and wonderful presentation, Ricardo. So you distinguish between semantic dialetheism and metaphysical dialectheism, arguing that Jiva's theology may involve contradictions that are only partially true, as you mentioned, at the semantic level. So my question is, how do you ensure that this semantic framework does not inadvertently imply an ontological contradiction in Jiva's metaphysics, especially given his repeated use of realist ontological claims about Shakti and Shaktiman? So that's my question.
Okay, thanks. That's a good question. Well, first of all, I can speak first specifically about my framework, and later more generally about semantic dialecticism. First, in my framework, we don't get to that ontological level. Again, as I said, I mean, right now, the whole thing is incomplete because I didn't give like a precise definition of what partial truth is. So it is incomplete. All right. I have a partial answer to that question. But anyway, but the point is that if we stick to the idea of partial truth, right? So we can say that partial truth is partially connected to the world because the way we assess claims as true and false, basically they answer our question, how language is related to the world, right? If you say that claim in specific statement is true, we say that the state of affairs that the sentence describes corresponds to the way the world is. But if we say that a specific state of claim or statement is partially true, we don't have that commitment that the statement, the state of affairs that the statement represents really correspond to the way the world is. So there is room for developing, in my approach, a theory according to which these partially true statements, they won't like represent the world as it is from an accurate point of view, let's say. And I think that's the whole idea, in one sense, of the analogies, because in all those analogies, they can really be understood from the perspective that there is some truth in the claim that sun and rain are different, and there's some truth in the claim that they are not different from each other. But that's not the whole story. But basically, my framework leaves room to, in other words, I can't say that those or some claims like this one, they are partially true. I can say that a contradiction is partially true, and I can still maintain that the world itself is not contradictory. It's not a difficult task to do that from a technical point of view. But about the more general position related to the distinction between metaphysical dialetheism and ontological dialetheism, perhaps I should say that, because what I'm trying to do is perhaps what I might call philosophical reconstruction, is not really exegesis. And as I mentioned in the beginning, my view is that Jīva is ambiguous about that, because there are some statements which seem to point to a kind of ontological contradiction. Some statements by Jīva that really, that there is one passage, I don't remember exactly the Sandarbha, I think the Paramatma Sandarbha, if I'm not mistaken, where he claims that Brahma has contradictory properties, or something that can be translated as properties. And this points to a kind of metaphysical dialetheism. So it's quite controversial whether or not Jiva's theology is really contradictory. But if we maintain like that from the surface of language, there are contradictions, right? The way to not to get in an ontological dialetheism is basically to defend that language is not powerful enough to represent reality. So at the same time that when we try to describe some part of reality, say the nature of God, we don't have a choice. We have to use a contradictory vocabulary. If we don't agree with this like full correspondence between language and the world, there's a kind of ineffability, but a partial one. We don't have to defend a full ineffability, but because the semantic contradiction would be equivalent. Oh, sorry, the semantic dialetheism would be the same as the metaphysical dialetheism. In other words, if we accept true contradictions, this will entail that there will be contradictory objects in the world only if there's this strong correspondence between language and the world, just if language is really able to fully describe reality. So if we don't support this very, very strong claim, so we might have like a contradictory description about God, for instance, which won't entail necessarily that God is in fact a contradictory entity. All right. So in another paper of mine, which was published in the International Journal of Philosophy of Religion this year, I speak a bit also about Jīva. I coined another term, which I term metaphysically neutral dialetheism, which is the position that I really prefer. Is the idea that we can defend this semantic dialetheism. We can use a contradictory vocabulary and discourse, and of course you'll have to use paraconsistent logic. But we can be agnostic to the question of whether or not the world itself is contradictory. Because semantic dialetheism, it claims that reality is not contradictory. It claims that there are no ontological contradictions. I don't think we need to claim that, right? Perhaps a more humble position is just to say that we can't be sure about how reality really is. We can't be sure about language, and because we use language, we have to know the rules of language and the logical rules and everything. But it's a bit a Kantian position, if you will. But perhaps maybe answering your question, semantic dialetheism doesn't really need to be the same thing as metaphysical dialetheism, because in order for this to be the case, we have to have this very strong presupposition about how language relates to the world.
Thank you. Thank you for your very deep reply. Do we have 2-3 minutes more?
Sure, yeah.
Yes,
I think so.
it depends. Yeah, I do.
Sorry, it's a little bit connected to your reply. So how do you justify, just a little challenge also for you to reply. So how do you justify this reconstruction textually in Jiva's own works,
Yes.
given that he never explicitly articulates a theory of partial truth?
Yes.
Jiva did not do that.
Yes.
So a little challenge for you. Does your model
Sure.
risk imposing a modern logical apparatus onto a pre-modern theological system? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a very important question. It has been posed before, right? So yeah, you might quite fairly ask why you are using a Western framework. Why don't you use Nyaya or not Nyaya? Well, I have a two-part answer. The first one is that it's a position of mine. Oh, first of all, we have to distinguish, and I'm distinguishing that. I'm not really trying to say how Jiva taught or what is the right position that Jiva really defended. That's a kind of exegesis. And in my view, I mean, as far as I can say, of course, Jiva, he was a systematic thinker, but in a very important sense, if you take a huge work like this in Tarbas, we are going to find different, I mean, perhaps different positions on the same theme. And I think that's the case about whether or not we have an actual contradiction here. But basically, I'm distinguishing my work from this kind of exegetical work in the following way. So, but also it's important to say that, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm really relying on the commentators. So what I'm really trying to do is to make sense of those two different positions about my presentation. The position of commentators, right? And of course, in order to do that, I have somehow to mention something about Jiva, because this solution to this disagreement has to be minimally consistent with Jiva's thought. However, I'm really doing this secondary level of work, right? But even somewhere else, I'm doing like a more primary work. So considering this more primary work, I really need to distinguish between like exegesis and what I call philosophical reconstruction. And we have several examples of this kind of work. And it's basically, I have the conviction, not only regarding Jiva's theology or Indian theology, but regarding, I would say, any kind of theology, that a theological corpus, it is in many sense incomplete, right? If you take Christianity as an example, people, I mentioned the Trinity, they have been for centuries debating how to make sense of this claim that God is one, and at the same time he's three. So as far as a religion is concerned, we don't have all the answers. We have to fill in the gaps, and there are many gaps. For instance, if you think about Jiva's tradition in particular, the nature of Radha and Krishna, for instance, they are the same, they're different, and the relation between Krishna and all the other avatars, and there are so many unanswered questions, and this the precise answer for these questions, in my view, are not like clearly there. I mean, we have find some indications, some clues about how to answer those questions, because otherwise there won't be disagreement, and we have disagreement between the several scholars and who belong to the tradition about important issues, not about all issues. So now getting to your answer, I think that philosophy is a universal enterprise. I don't, that's a position of mine, and some people, they think the same. I think that philosophy is really universal. And if you take a look, I mean, carefully, you are going to see that the same questions, they were raised in different cultures in different times. So they what some people call the big questions, they are everywhere. I mean, it doesn't depend on culture. Of course, these questions are framed in specific ways because of the language that people use, because the assumption that they use, because the worldview that they have, of course. But if we agree on that philosophy is a universal enterprise, I think in order to solve a philosophical problem, and the problem of saying what really is the best way to understand this or that theology, I take that as a philosophical problem. So, but if we follow that path, we should use the best tools that are available, the best conceptual tools. So the question is, we have nice tools, logical tools, right? Those logics and logically, I mean, had an amazing development in the past 100 years or so. And compared to Aristotelian logic, and even compared to Nyayo logic, it's much more developed. So the question is, why not use those tools? If you take that as a universal problem. So, of course, if you are doing comparative philosophy, it's something different. Then you have to. And what I spoke here is just a tiny part of the whole thing. Of course, a more complete work. In a more complete work, I will have to see the logical tools that Jīva use, Navanyaya, and which presuppositions he accepted, which presuppositions he rejected. It would be a much more complete and much bigger work, right? But given this assumption of mine, which I just mentioned, the universality of philosophical reflection, I don't see it as a problem to use like a Western. I don't even like this term, Western. Of course, you can use Western philosophy, but again, philosophy is not exclusive neither to the West or to the East, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that's a deep topic, of course, but thank you for asking. I'm not sure if I asked.
Yes, and thank you for your very deep
to answer the question.
Thank you.
Okay, let's stop here. Thank you very much for all the questions. And I hope everyone enjoyed and learned something new today and something to think about more deeply. Thank you, sir. We will share the YouTube link once it is ready. And we hope to invite you in person also. If you ever happen to come back to India, Pune, we are in Pune. Our campus is right here. That's our campus.
Beautiful,
so,
beautiful.
Thank you. With that, Hare Krishna, and yes.
Hare Krishna, take care.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. All the best.